So if you guys want to follow me on Instagram, it's right here at Muller Sports Psych, and I'm happy to answer questions over Instagram if you guys have any. Also, if you do have any questions, just put them in chat and your coach will let me know at the end and read me the questions. We'll jump in and get started here. So what mental skills does an athlete need to excel to their highest potential? It's a really great question, and right now there are a million different answers. On this slide are a few examples that I picked out from the internet of different models different people have created. But there's really no universal agreement among sports psychology professionals on which traits or skills are the most important or are necessary for athletic success. However, I did find one model that I really like. It is comprehensive and it's research-based, and it creates a really good roadmap for any athlete seeking to improve their mental game. It's called the Gold Medal Profile, and I think you guys will enjoy the fact that it's Canadian. It's the best compilation I have found, although the terms and the organization that they use are a little different from what you normally see. However, it is very thorough and well balanced, and it is evidence-based. So it came about in 2019 when a Canadian nonprofit called Own the Podium, whose mission it is to propel Canadian athletes to Olympic and Paralympic medals, they assembled a group of 6 elite sports psychologists to come up with a model to help athletes excel. And the result is what they dubbed as the Gold Medal Profile for Sports Psychology. So the mission of these elite sports psychologists was to synthesize the vast and expanding literature on sports psychology to create a definitive list of what mental skills separate the good from the great, and how that other athletes could develop those skills to improve their game. And so it says expressly that this model is to be used to educate athletes, coaches, and staff about the importance of mental performance skills to achieve success in sports. The way it works is they divided it up into 11 mental performance competencies, which is then divided into 3 categories. All of these categories contribute to maximizing athletic performance and maintaining mental health. And by the way, it is the first model to incorporate mental health as an explicit goal, which I think is highly needed. And I think that's a really great idea. So let's jump in a little more. The first category, colored gold up here, because it's considered the most important, contains the fundamental competencies that underlie all the other ones. And that is motivation, confidence, and resilience. The second category, the silver category over here, is considered the second most important. And that includes the self-regulation skills, including self-awareness, stress management, emotional and arousal regulation, and for attentional control, which is what I would call concentration or focus. So just to make sure you guys know what they mean when they say emotional or arousal regulation. So when you're upset, when you're anxious, when you're distressed, you are physically and emotionally dysregulated. That means your nervous system is kind of out of whack. You may have sweaty hands or pounding hard or tension in your muscles, or you might feel jittery. So that would be dysregulation. When you're calm, physically and emotionally, then you're regulated. So basically this category is about the ability to calm yourself down and focus no matter what the situation is around you. The final category over here, the bronze category, is the interpersonal competencies, which is the athlete's ability to deal with other people. So obviously that applies more in team sports, but it does also apply in individual sports. It's how the athlete deals with their coaches, their training partners, their physical therapists, their trainers, sponsors, agents, all the other people who are part of their team. And the 4 components of that are athlete-coach relationship, leadership, teamwork, and communication. So after taking a look at this model, you might start wondering what is missing. It's not the usual list of skills. So some of the skills you might have been expecting on the chart are missing, like goal setting, visualization, self-talk, 3 of the most fundamental and crucial skills for sports psychology. And that's because this model is designed differently. Instead of listing skills, it's identifying 11 psychological areas that a successful athlete will navigate in a skillful way. So the idea is that each athlete will be assessed in each area and then assisted to build competency in any area where they're lacking. So in this model, those skills are categorized as subsidiary competencies, those ones that can be used to support the 11 major areas. For example, self-talk can be used in different ways to support different areas. You might use it for motivation and confidence, telling yourself, I can do this. You might use it for attentional control, or what I would call concentration, using performance cues like we discussed in the last talk, things like I'm going to hold my line, or I'm going to keep hips up. Those kind of cues through self-talk can keep you focused on what you want to focus on. And then they have listed separately some skills that are specific to certain types of sports, like over here, the pain management for endurance sports, fear management in the speed and acrobatic sports, and creativity in the aesthetic sports. So as you can see, it's a little different way of framing sports psychology, but I think it's a really comprehensive and helpful way. It makes a lot of sense to me, and I hope it does to you too. So how did Canada do after creating this model? They did pretty well, as you can see. And while this is a great roadmap for an athlete to use, it probably isn't the final answer to the question of what it takes, psychologically speaking, to own the podium. But it's a really great starting point, and I think it's a great framework to work with. And I'm sure as time goes on, they'll probably develop this model further. Today, we're going to dive deep into two of these so-called subsidiary competencies, because these skills can be used to strengthen multiple domains of competency in this model. So we're going to cover self-talk, both negative and positive, and we're going to talk about effective visualization. Both of these apply to all three of the fundamentals over here: motivation, confidence, and resilience, and to some of the silver category, the regulation category as well. So self-talk is the way you talk to yourself silently in your head, or your inner voice. Some people aren't even aware of it because they're just so used to it being part of themselves. But almost certainly everyone is having some self-talk in their head. Self-talk is really important because it has a big impact on how you feel and on what you do. We have a tendency to listen to our self-talk, even though it's not rational or logical. Somehow, simply because it's inside our head, we trust it. Self-talk tends to be pessimistic, and it focuses on the negative or the bad. It can erode your self-confidence, and it can stop you from reaching your potential. It can make you feel like you're going to fail before you even start. Some examples might be, I'm never going to be able to do this. I'm not good at this. I'm not as talented as everyone else. They're all going to beat me. Thoughts like that pop into our head during practices or during meets. Negative self-talk often does not reflect reality. It usually doesn't. It is distorted, exaggerated, and blown out of proportion. And even though many people don't think to question it because it's inside their own head, the fact is it's usually not a very accurate representation of reality. So most of the athletes I work with, they tend to be their own worst critic. Their inner voice is full of negativity and undermines their confidence. They criticize themselves and they never feel good enough. And this is particularly true in stressful circumstances. So when you're under pressure, that negative voice tends to come out more. So we're going to start by looking at how to deal with that negative self-talk, and then we're going to look at how to develop positive self-talk to help you feel more confident and to perform better. So all competitive athletes have dealt with negative self-thoughts at some point in their career, if not throughout their career. And that's because once you decide to take a risk, that inner voice is going to pop up with questions, fears, and doubts. It's the brain's way of self-preservation. The brain is designed to keep you safe. It's all about survival and safety. It is not designed for sports performance, which requires risk and pain, things that the brain would rather avoid. And if you recall from our mindset talk, this is what happens when there's a threat perception. So just a fun fact, every day your brain processes approximately 70,000 thoughts. And probably like most people, you don't question what your mind tells you. You probably take what it says very seriously. You believe that if your mind says something, it must be important. And no matter how mean your mind can be to you, you tend to give it respect and trust. And that's the problem. Thoughts are not facts. Thoughts are not inherently meaningful. The content of your thoughts is not necessarily important. So there's a healthier way to approach your mind, which is don't take it so seriously. Don't believe everything it says. Don't treat your mind as a trustworthy source of information, especially about things that are making you anxious or when you're taking a risk with an uncertain outcome, like swimming a race. So negative self-talk is simply your brain considering every possible dangerous or risky outcome, trying to deal with that perceived threat to safety. Throughout history, this type of thinking probably helped humans survive in a threatening world. However, in our modern world, it's a fear that makes things feel really dangerous, but in fact, they are not life-threatening, things like on the slide. So we're not afraid of getting eaten by that saber-toothed tiger, but the fear of failure or embarrassment or criticism can feel just as risky to that older part of our brain, because in the past, social rejection meant death for our cavemen and women ancestors, and our modern brain just hasn't caught up with that yet. So the main point here to remember is that negative self-talk is driven by fear. And just to review really quickly, when we're afraid, it triggers anxiety, tension, and constriction. So we'll quickly look at how that threat perception versus challenge perception affects that mind-body connection that we talked about more in detail last time. So when we're having that negative self-talk, we're probably in threat perception. We're probably having anxiety. We're more likely to make mistakes. We've got that vasoconstriction going on, which is reducing blood flow. We've got constricted airflow, so we're getting less oxygen. When we're depleting our glucose, we have less energy. Versus in contrast, if you're not having that negative self-talk, you're gonna have less anxiety. You're gonna be able to think more clearly and focused. You're gonna have vasodilation, meaning increased blood flow. Bronchodilation, meaning increased oxygen, and higher energy production. So the problem isn't necessarily that you're having negative thoughts. It's normal to have negative thoughts, and everyone has them. So you don't want to fight them or try to control them or try to have zero of them. Instead, you want to understand that it's a byproduct of being in a pressure situation or where you're taking a risk. So what it boils down to is when there's uncertainty about the outcome, you're probably going to experience some negative thoughts. And as stated on the slide, the brain does not like uncertainty or risk. It wants to prepare for the worst possible outcomes, for the possible pitfalls, etc. And that's what results in the negative thoughts that we have. It's the brain preparing itself to deal with anything negative that might happen as a result of the risk or uncertainty. So our first tool to deal with negative self-talk comes from a core process in acceptance and commitment therapy, also known as ACT. It is called diffusion. It means separating from our thoughts and letting them come and go instead of getting wrapped up in them. Through diffusion, our thoughts will no longer have control over our actions and behaviors. In ACT terms, diffusion is the opposite of fusion, which is what we do when we get caught up in our thoughts and feelings and let them control our actions. With diffusion, we're not really interested in whether the thought is true or false. We only focus on whether the thought is helpful. Does it help you become the person you want to be? Does it encourage action that will help you move forward in a positive way? So ACT treats the inner critic voice like it's a meaningless mind chatter, and it seeks to shift attention away from the content, what it is saying, to the form, insignificant noise in our head. And one way to create diffusion is to name thoughts as if they were a story or a book. For example, the I'm not good enough story. Each time this story shows up in your head, you just say to yourself, there it is again, the I'm not good enough story. It's not easy to get this kind of separation because we're much more used to fusing with the thought and the feelings and getting caught up in all of it. But with practice, you can become really good at diffusion, and it's very helpful when you get to that point. So for example, if you're thinking, I'm a failure and I'm never going to get any better, that has a certain impact on your body and on your mood and your attitude, your confidence, etc. Compare that to thinking, I'm noticing I'm having a thought that I'm a failure and I'll never get any better. It's that I'm not good enough story again. It's just thoughts. I don't have to believe them. Thoughts come and go. So that has a really different impact on your motivation, your confidence, your physiology, etc. So we're all going to compare ourselves to others. We're all going to judge ourselves. We're all going to have negative thoughts about ourselves. That's very normal. Diffusion helps us set those thoughts aside and focus on what's important. That is that thought helping me? So here's just another example to get the difference between the two ways of looking at your thoughts. One is to just accept that I am not good enough and I don't belong at this meet. Another is to then go, my inner critic is suggesting I'm not good enough and I don't belong at this meet, but it's just mindless chatter and it's unhelpful, so I don't have to pay attention to it. So the next tool we're going to look at is to name your inner critic voice. This helps to create distance from the thought and to remind yourself not to take your thoughts too seriously. Giving your inner critic a nickname can also help you to see that you are not the problem. The real problem is when you believe that negative inner voice. When you give it a goofy name like Negative Nancy or Debbie Downer, it decreases the power of the thought, and you can easily call it out the next time you have those thoughts. It will also help you see how silly some of your thoughts are and make them less threatening. So you can name that inner critic anything you want. I've heard of people naming their inner critic Karen, the wolf, the judge, Negative Nellie, the grumpy old man, the saboteur, and judgmental Judy. You can use whatever you want. One person used the character from from the movie Inside Out named Disgust. You can see that one here. And she liked that it gave the character a whole look and voice and personality that she could use in her mind so that she could set that voice apart from knowing that it's not necessarily true. It's just this part of her talking. So naming your inner critic allows you to get some space from that negative voice. And you realize that your inner critic is not something you have to take seriously. And that diminishes the power of that negative voice. So for example, if you're behind the blocks about to race a 200 IM and you start thinking, I'm not good enough to make that futures cut in this. Abby over there, she's much better than me. Then you might tell yourself, oh, it's that Debbie Downer voice with the old I'm not good enough story. I don't have to believe that nonsense. So if anyone thinks of a name they like for their inner critic, I would love to hear them, and you can put them in chat. And Coach, you can let me know at the end if you get any good names for some inner critics. Our next tool for looking at those negative self-thoughts is going to be cognitive distortions. So depending on who you talk to, negative self-talk can involve up to 15 different types of cognitive distortions. Though a lot of them kind of overlap. Here, we're only going to focus on three, the top three I see when I work with athletes. So cognitive distortion is a way of thinking that leads you to view things more negatively than they really are. When examined, instead of just accepted, they prove to be illogical, irrational, exaggerated, inaccurate, and negatively biased. So you can see why they're also called mind traps. The first one we're going to look at is called magnification and minimization. Basically, in our mind, we blow up the negative things much bigger than they really are, and we dismiss or reduce the significance of the positive things. And thus we get as a result of that, a very distorted picture. So an example of this might be an athlete who had a great week of training leading into a meet, but then they had one set where he didn't do well, and the athlete focuses on that and dwells on that one set and convinces himself that he won't be able to swim well at the meet. So he's blowing up the one negative thing and he's dismissing the positive things he did. Or it might be like on this picture over here on the slide, he might view his competitor through a magnifying lens and convince himself his competitor is the next Michael Phelps. And he might see all of his strengths blow up bigger than they are, and he might minimize his own strengths. Either way you look at it, he's distorting reality. He's blowing up the negative and minimizing the positive. So a few more examples. An athlete who goes a 105 flat on their 100 breaststroke, and then they just focus on the fact that they didn't break 105, was what was their goal. And they're ignoring the fact that they dropped 1.5 seconds. That would be another example. Or an athlete who wins the high point award at a meet, but they may minimize the significance of the award and continue to believe that this athlete, she believes she's only a mediocre athlete because she didn't win any single event. Well, she placed second and third in several events. The next one we're going to talk about is called overgeneralization. So that's when you come to a general conclusion based on a single incident or two. So we have this tendency as humans that once something bad happens, we tend to expect it to happen over and over again. And we see it as a never-ending pattern. So if you catch yourself using the words like always and never, those are some clues that you're overgeneralizing. So for example, if your first swim at a 3-day swim meet isn't good, you may then project into the future that all your swims over that 3-day meet are going to be bad. Or an athlete may think to themselves, I always miss making the A final after that happens in 1 or 2 events, when in reality, they have made the A final many other times. Another example is thinking that since you had a bad meet at a certain pool, and then you go to that pool the next time to race there, you think that it's also going to be bad because you had a bad meet there before. And the final one we're going to look at is called catastrophizing. This is also called worst case scenario thinking. So as an example, it might be that you didn't have a great night's sleep and you determine in your mind that you're not going to be able to swim well because of that. However, we know that many great swims have come after the athlete has not had a great night's sleep the night before. And in fact, when Caleb Dressel won his 5 Olympic gold medals, he later said that he didn't sleep well for the whole of the Olympics. So one night's sleep is really not that big a deal, but in our mind, we create this worst case scenario where it means that we're not going to be able to perform well. And we think it's real when it's not. It's really just fear taking over. Another current example of that is Leon Marchand. If you've been watching the men's NC2As, he said the night before his 400 IM, he didn't get a great night's sleep, yet obviously he had an amazing swim. So what do you do when you're having these cognitive distortions, when you see that? When you catch yourself in that negative thinking, you want to check and see, are any of these mind traps coming up? You want to identify, am I doing that magnifying and minimizing thing? Am I overgeneralizing? Am I catastrophizing? Another one of these is that all or nothing thinking that we went over in the previous talk, Mindset Matters. All or nothing thinking is also a mind trap. So a big part of dismantling our cognitive distortions is simply being aware of them and paying attention to how we are framing things to ourselves. So deconstructing it means recognizing the negative bias in how you are thinking. Even just having this recognition can go a long way to making you feel better. You want to develop good mental habits. You want to check your thinking for distortions. It's just as important as having good physical habits for your well-being. If we're going to frame things in a healthy, positive way, we almost certainly are going to experience less anxiety. This doesn't mean that we're ignoring problems or challenges or feelings, just that we approach them with a more balanced perspective instead of letting our thoughts and feelings amplify our anxiety out of proportion. After you've identified what cognitive distortion might be popping up for you, and people tend to have 2 or 3 that they use the most. So if you can just identify what you tend to pop up with, the next step is to rebut the arguments in your head with reasonable responses. This is best done in advance if you can, because it's hard to think clearly in the moment when you're there at the swim meet getting ready for your race. So before your race, before you go to the meet, take time to think about, what does my mind usually tell me, and write up a list, and then write up the rebuttals. And if you have a hard time with writing up the rebuttals, take someone you trust and ask them to help you. It could be a coach, could be a parent, could be a teammate. So for example, if you find yourself thinking, I'm not good enough to make the 200 IM final at this meet, then you might put on your rebuttal list how your coach has actually told you that he thinks you can make finals. And not only that, he thinks you can be top 3. And how you made all those tough sets that we're focusing on the IM this year, and how you've been lifting even more weight this year. Any evidence you can come up with that counters the irrational judgment that your mind has leaped to. So down here, I like this acronym FEAR, false evidence appearing real, because in the moment, it can feel very real. And this can help you remember that it's really not real. It's really not based in reality. It's just a really strong feeling, and that makes us think that it's real. And if you don't know exactly what thoughts are going to pop up at meets, you can prepare in advance a list of how hard you've worked, all the past sets you've done. Maybe you have a logbook you can look through. You're going to want to list your successes and the people who believe in you. And you want to use that list to rebut any of those negative thoughts that come up. So the last tool for stopping that negative self-talk, or really not stopping it, but countering it, changing it, shifting it, is to focus on what you can control in the present moment. So you want to shift your focus from away from things like, how prepared is my opponent? What's he going to do? This is the result I want to get, or someone else's opinion, what they might think if I don't do well, that kind of thing. You want to switch it to these over here. And I gave you a little swimming ape here to help you remember these, APEE. Attitude, preparation, effort, and execution. You want to focus on those things instead of whatever your negative thoughts were focusing on, which are likely to be things that are out of your control and not in the present moment. So now that we've got some tools for dealing with negative self-talk, we're going to switch to the flip side of the coin, which is positive self-talk. Some of the benefits of positive self-talk include improved performance, better regulation of emotions, and improved confidence. So how do you do that? The first tool we're going to look at is, I jumped ahead a slide. Those athletes that excel under pressure tend to have a handle on their self-talk. They're good at talking back to their negative self-talk, and they're good at using positive self-talk to support themselves. And the easiest way for most people to figure out what to say to themselves for positive self-talk is to think about what they would say to their best friend if their friend came to them and told them the same thing that they are telling themselves. So for example, if an athlete was thinking, I'm never going to make the A final, I'm just not good enough, The athlete would imagine their best friend telling them that, and then what they would say back to their friend. Maybe something like, what do you mean? You were really close to making the A final last year, and this year you've done so well at the other meets and in practice. You work so hard every day. You've improved so much. Your strength is better. Your turns are better. You've got this. And then they return and repeat that to themselves. So next we're going to listen to Kimberly Vandenberg, who was a member of the U.S. Women's 4x200 free relay at the 2008 Summer Olympics in Beijing, and they won the bronze medal in that. She also won the silver medal at the 2005 World University Games and at the 2007 World Championships in the women's 200 fly. So in this video, she actually talks a lot about a bunch of different mental skills she uses, but we're only going to listen to the part on self-talk.
And heard about self-talk, I was at UCLA, and Cindy Gallagher, the head coach at the time and one of my mentors and very close friends, Cindy and I would talk a lot about what I was thinking. So like, what am I thinking about when I'm at a big competition and I just missed the team, or I didn't do well, or I had a bad performance. And I was very fortunate, and so were you, as a UCLA student athlete, to have access to sports psychologists. So when I missed the Olympic team, I tried out for the Olympic team 5 times, which I think is a pretty cool thing because I missed it 4 times, but I made it 1 time. So I have the perspective of missing it more than I've made it. And then the key to how I made it, it was all through self-talk. And so when I missed it the first time, missed it the second time, a lot of it was my focus being on other people, my focus being on my competitors, my focus being on things that were not in my control, right? And so I think with self-talk, the more you can focus in on what my race plan was, how am I going to swim a 200 butterfly? What's my breathing pattern going to be? What's my strategy? What can I control? I can only control my lane, stay in your lane, have the peripheral, be aware of other people, but focus on what you can control. And for a lot of my career, I was worried about what lane 2 was doing or what lane 6 was doing, but I was in lane 4, so that was really hard. And that is really hard to do in life, I think, to not compare yourself to other people. Everyone has a different journey. But the more focused I was on my own race strategy and my own plan, I was able to perform at a higher level. Now, the self-talk that happened in practice, if I was having a bad day, if I felt sick, if I felt off, if I felt whatever it was, that's what I think is the most important and the most interesting space to be in. Because if you're feeling like crap, if you're not feeling 100%, what are you saying to yourself? Are you giving up? Are you just talking negatively? Are you beating yourself up? And so I would just really try to be gentle with myself if I was feeling off, listen to it. And it's not easy to shift right away, but just bringing awareness to your self-talk when you're not feeling great is the first step, and then the more awareness you have of your self-talk, then you could start kind of shifting it to the positive. But it's a daily practice. It's not easy to do. I think it's really easy to be negative. I feel like most people, if they don't have self-awareness, don't have that self-talk dialogue, they kind of go to the negative and something is wrong all the time, instead of focusing on what we can be grateful for.
I love that.
And heard about self-talk,
There we go. So just a real quick review about some of the key points in that video. So she missed making the Olympic team 4 times, and she believes the key to the time she did make it to the Olympic team was her self-talk. Yeah, surprise. So when she missed the team, her self-talk was focused on her competitors and other things not within her control. When she focused on her own race and the things she could control, that was when she made the Olympic team. And then she talked about how often did she practice positive self-talk. She did it as a daily practice. She didn't just try to suddenly use it at the Olympic trials. She used it every day in practice and at meets. And it is a skill and it is something you develop. She talked about how it's not easy. So you're not going to be able to just suddenly turn it on when you're in a pressure situation. You want to be practicing it every day. And then she talked about this key point. How do you shift from that negative self-talk to that positive self-talk? She said she would be gentle to herself and she would listen and be aware of it. And then as she got better at it, she was able to shift it to the more positive talk. So just remember, our brains are wired for survival. They are The default thinking is going to be negative thinking because it's trying to protect us from a perceived threat. So that means it's going to take effort. You have to proactively shift your thinking to positive thoughts. It doesn't just happen. You have to actually make the effort. So here are 3 tools to help you do that, to make it easier. The first one we're going to look at is mantras. And mantras can be a very powerful self-talk tool. You want to choose 1 or 2 phrases that work for you. Your chosen mantra, you should use it at practice and at meets on a daily basis, just like we were talking about. The more you use it, the more natural it will seem when you're in that pressure situation. I recommend you write it down somewhere where you will see it regularly. Maybe a Post-it note on your mirror, maybe you write it on your kickboard, maybe you have it on your water bottle, somewhere where you're going to remind yourself to keep using that phrase. So I want you now to take some time to think of what mantra might work for you. You might get one from this slide. I'm going to read some more in the next slide, or you might come up with one in your own. You might tweak something. Feel free to go online and Google them, but try to come up with 1 or 2 that will work for you. So on this slide, we have, I am strong and tough. I can do this. I am turning into the greatest athlete. I always give it my best. I am always getting better. I've worked hard and I'm ready for this. I am an amazing competitor. I am a highly skilled athlete. I am becoming better and better every day. I finished my races strong. I can handle this. I excel when challenged. I love racing. I love working hard. Pain doesn't stop me. I do my best when challenged. I focus on what I can control. I am confident in myself. I believe in myself. I know I can do it. You guys probably know who Ariana Titmus is, the Australian swimmer. She's the reigning Olympic champion in the 200 and 400 freestyle, having won both those events at the 2020 Summer Olympics, famously defeating Katie Ledecky. She says that her mantra that she uses is be the best you can be. And she uses that in practice and at meets. She also said in interviews that she uses a lot of self-talk, again, both in practice and at competitions. So I like that one, be the best that you can be. The next tool is to practice different scenarios. In particular, if you know there are certain situations that lead to you thinking in a negative way, you want to, in advance, come up with language that will help you think more positively about the situation. So for example, if you know when people get ahead of you in the race, that's when your negative thinking starts, then you want to prepare a script. For example, something like, anything can happen. I'm not out of this yet. I've come from behind before. Don't let up. That kind of thing. Another example might be, say you're in the finals of the 100 back at state and you find yourself doubting whether you can beat the other top 2 swimmers. You might write to yourself, I'm capable of beating them. I'm capable of winning state. I just need to focus on my own race. I have worked hard and I've improved my underwaters and I've hit pace in practice. I know I can do this. Something like that. And then the last trick is to pair those positive statements with positive imagery. When you do that, when you take a combination of words and imagery together, it's a very strong, positive, and vivid message to your brain and body. And we're going to go into visualization more in a moment, but combining the 2 can be a very powerful tool. So in the example here, the swimmer might have had thoughts like, everyone passes me in the breaststroke leg if I am. It's my weak stroke. I'll fall behind like I always do. So anticipating this, he might have created phrases to repeat to himself as he swims breaststroke. I can do this, snap my kick and shoot forward. Or he might shorten it to, I can do this, snap and shoot. Whatever language works for him. Then when he comes up with a statement, he would pair it with an image of himself swimming breaststroke with a strong snapping kick and his body surging forward. Then whenever he thinks of that statement, he also imagines that image. So this phrase and image is positive. It keeps him focused on the present moment, what he's doing in the present, and on what he needs to do well in that breaststroke leg. So he's not thinking about the outcome. He's thinking about, how am I going to execute this race? If he lets his mind go unchecked without something to think, he might find himself thinking, oh no, I can't keep up. Everyone's passing me, and he might panic. He might spin his wheels. But by having this phrase and image to use, he can stay positive and give himself the best chance to do well. So now we're going to jump into visualization. Visualization is a really crucial skill, and it's helpful in multiple ways, as you can see here. Of course, most people use it because they want to improve their performance, which it can help with that, but it also can help in other ways too. So most people call it visualization. That's the most common name, but it really should probably be called mental rehearsal because it's not just seeing it, it's really using all of your senses to make it as real and vivid as possible. So visualization, in addition to helping performance, can help athletes regulate their anxiety, to stay more confident, and to be more focused and mentally tough. It also is programming their unconscious mind so that they can go on autopilot. So next, we're going to listen to Bob Bowman, Michael Phelps's coach, talking about visualization.
And putting your mind in a place where you can actually visualize effectively. I know when Michael was young, I gave his mom a book of progressive relaxation, and before he would go to bed at night, she would go in and read this progression of things to do, like clench your fist, take
basically,
you through
it's like you work through your whole entire
body. And actually, it got so good, she just opened the book, say 2 things, and he'd be asleep. He got really good at relaxing. So once you can put yourself in a relaxed state, then I tell them it's like watching a movie. So it's essentially what it is. Sometimes it's like you're sitting in the stands watching yourself swim. And sometimes it's like you're in the water swimming. The key to visualization is, number one, it has to be very vivid. It has to be rehearsed many, many times. And the reason it works is because the brain cannot distinguish between something that's really vividly visualized and something that's real. So by the time Michael steps up on the block to swim a race in a World Championships or Olympic Games, he's swum that race hundreds of times in his mind before he gets up there. So then when he gets up, all he has to do is shut everything down and it goes on autopilot. His body automatically knows what to do. The brain just switches into what he's visualized. And that's what's really powerful about visualization.
When I would visualize, it would be what you want it to be, what you don't want it to be, what it could be.
Yeah.
So it's like you're always ready for anything that comes your way. So it's like if I would have a suit rip, fine, I need another suit, put it on. Like any small thing that could go wrong, I'm ready for.
So as Bob Bowman said, the power of visualization is that your brain doesn't know the difference between what is real and what is vividly imagined. The key is to input your feeling into that visualization, and that's what makes it come alive to the mind. And when you understand about how powerful that is, your mind believing it's real, you realize that that's a real advantage. Without even getting in the pool, your brain can believe that you've swum that perfect race hundreds of times. And that's going to give you confidence. It's also going to program that unconscious mind so that you can go on autopilot. And that's when we see peak performance happen for athletes. And that's what Bob Bowman and Michael Phelps were talking about there. And as the slide is saying, he's certainly not the only elite athlete who uses visualization. Lots of athletes do. The power of visualization has been known for a long time, and in more recent years, it's been backed up by the research. So studies have found that we can activate motor centers in the brain by imagination alone and without actually performing the movement. When you visualize something, you activate the same neural pathways in the brain as if you were actually experiencing those things in real life. And the more you activate those particular neural pathways, the more myelin is going to wrap around them, which makes the connections easier for the brain to access. And that's how you get that strong mental picture for the brain to go toward, that autopilot. So in fact, visualizing movement changes how our brain networks are organized, creating more connections and strengthening connections among the different regions. Visualization also stimulates the rehearsal of movement regions of the brain, which primes the brain and the body for action so that we're moving more effectively. And over time, the brain will learn our routine movements, allowing these actions to become automatic and fine-tuned. So if you think about learning to drive a car, at first it takes a lot of effort and concentration. How hard do you press on the gas? How far do you turn the steering wheel? But then soon after time, it becomes automatic and you don't need to think too much. And that's the same kind of thing you want to happen with your swimming race. You don't want to have to think too much. You want to be the body and mind to just know what it needs to do. And that's when you're going to have that peak athletic performance. So this is a question I always ask myself because most people I talk to, most of the athletes don't use visualization very much. They maybe do it a few times on paper and that's it. But as you heard Bob Bowman say, it needs to have been hundreds of times. You want to have gone through that. So I think the reason is because it actually takes a lot of energy. The brain uses a lot of energy, more than most people realize. And to do visualization well, it takes concentration and effort. And especially if you're just learning how to do it, if you've never done it before. It does get easier as you do it more, but at first it can be kind of difficult. And that's another issue is time. Sometimes people don't want to spend the time doing it. They're already putting in so much time training for their sport. Maybe they think it's a waste of time, but it's definitely not a waste of time. And unless you swim the mile, it really doesn't take that long. For a 200 of stroke, it maybe takes 3 or 4 minutes. So it's really not that big of a commitment time-wise, but it is effort-wise. You do have to concentrate. So some of the questions I get about visualization is, do I first person, me in the water swimming, or should I do it third person, me up in the stands watching? What if like my brain skips around, I can't see myself swimming that event, or if old races are popping up instead of seeing one in the future? So there's a lot of questions about how can you do it? And that first question about whether to visualize from a first person perspective, you in the water, or that third person perspective, watching yourself swim, there really isn't a definitive answer. When we visualize ourselves in the first person, we only see what is around us. But when we imagine ourselves from that third person, we get kind of a more big picture vision. And that can also help us see more of specifically what exactly our body is doing. Now, there are some studies that show that imagining in the first person may activate the muscles more powerfully than when we visualize ourselves in the third person. Now, then again, Michael Phelps used both when he would visualize, and probably both are beneficial, but maybe it would be best to emphasize the first person perspective a little more than that third person perspective. Further, I have found in my practice that if someone can't see themselves perform successfully in the first person, that usually means there's some kind of mental block there. So whether you go blank, you skip ahead, it gets blurry or fuzzy, or old races pop up instead of the race you're trying to view, whatever it is that happens that prevents you from having that successful visualization, I have found that by brain spotting on it, we're able to eliminate that block, and people are able to get to the point where they can experience the whole visualization. And as soon as that happens, they start telling me how they feel better in the water, they feel looser, they feel less nervous, and they're swimming faster. So that's just a little shortcut I have found to help people, is if they can't visualize themselves in the future having that successful race, there's something going on in that subconscious that needs to be worked through. So how do we do it effectively? Many experts believe that success in sports will come from this ability to see yourself executing those skills successfully in your mind first, before you can perform it. And the more real and vivid you make it, the better. According to one study, 70 to 90% of Olympians are now regularly using visualization. So the first step is to get into that relaxed state. Michael Phelps used progressive muscle relaxation. That's the process they were trying to describe there. And there are lots of scripts available online for progressive muscle relaxation, or PMR. And you can listen to those for free to get into that relaxed state. But you can use any relaxation technique you want. There are other breathing exercises and all kinds of things you can do. The next step is to set the scene. So when you set the scene, you want to make it as realistic, as specific, and as detailed as possible. So if you've been to that pool before where your taper meet's going to be, you want to see that exact setting. If you happen to know what lane you're going to be in, you want to see yourself in that lane. You want to be as detailed and real as possible. That's how the brain is really going to make it seem real. And the third and fourth steps there, including the senses and the emotion, that is also that part about making it come alive, making the brain believe it's really happening. That fifth step there, this is proprioception, which is the sixth sense. And it's the awareness of where your body is in space and how your body is positioned and how it's moving. And so what that really means is when you're visualizing it, you want to feel it in your body. You want your body to know what that feels like. You want to see the whole race. Sometimes when I talk to people, they only see little parts of the race. You want to be able to start from behind the blocks and go all the way through. When you hit your hand on the wall, you look up and see your time. If you want, you can continue through seeing, like, getting congratulations and hugs, going up on the podium, getting your award. That's fine if you want to do that too. Some people also like to go all the way back and start when they're warming up for their race and go all the way through. As long as you're including that whole race, that's fine. The other thing you want to do is make it part of your routine so that you're not forgetting it. And this seems to happen a lot. So I had one client, he would arrive 10 minutes early to practice, and he would sit in his car and visualize his races before practice. He said he liked that because not only was he getting the visualization done, but it motivated him when he'd go into practice because he had this clear picture in his mind of his goal. So that's a really good way to do it. Other clients I've had do it while they brush their teeth every day, or when they're in the shower, or they wake up 5 minutes early and they sit up in bed so they don't fall back asleep. That's one way to do it. It's best not to do it right before bed, which is when people have a tendency to want to do it. The problem is people tend to fall asleep and then it doesn't get done. So if you are going to do it at bedtime, I recommend you try sitting up or not going into the bed, sitting in a chair, have the lights on, that kind of thing. So a few more tips on how to do visualization. Especially at first, it can be tiring. It is a mental skill and it does take mental energy. So it's going to take time and effort to develop the skill. So don't expect perfection right away. Just keep practicing and you will get better. And then focus on the quality. Begin by imagining high quality images for short periods of time and then gradually increase the time. So maybe the first few times you do it, you're only seeing yourself behind the blocks, getting on the blocks, doing your start, doing your underwater and your breakout. And once you have that part really nailed down, then you might add in the first lap of the race or something like that and just keep building from there. And so here's Katie Ledecky over here talking about her visualization. And she's talking about, she knows how her stroke should feel at different parts of the race. And I can picture that in my mind. So when she's visualizing, she's feeling that in her body, and that is the key. So these two ways here are the ways that Michael Phelps used visualization. The first was preparing himself for competition by imagining himself performing under that pressure at that competition. And the second was visualizing solutions for mistakes or unexpected situations or changes of plan. In each case, no matter what happens, whether he said his suit rips, your goggles fill with water, there's a delay before you swim, a competitor goes out much faster than you expect, whatever it is, you see yourself not getting flustered, you stay calm and you overcome that obstacle. So you always see yourself doing really well, nailing the race, no matter what happens around you. And as we have mentioned, I think in the past, this came in really handy for Michael Phelps at the 2008 Beijing Olympics. In his chase for the 8 gold medals, during the final of the 200 fly, his goggles filled up with water. Finals at the Olympics. What worse time could there be, right? And he credits visualization with helping save him during that race. He says that when my goggles filled up with water, I was relaxed because I reverted back to my training. I swam blind for 175 meters out of a 200-meter fly, and I won gold and broke the world record. So for him, it was partly he knew his stroke count and partly he had visualized that race so many times, and he visualized himself not panicking when something went wrong, just handling it and keep moving forward. And that's what he did, and it worked for him. A few more ways you can use it. If you normally get distracted and you have a hard time concentrating, then you might visualize yourself staying relaxed and focused in the presence of those distractions. So that's an example of rehearsing a perceived weakness or problem. Or if perhaps you get really nervous at competition, you're going to want to imagine yourself performing exactly the way you want and being calm and poised under those conditions that would normally have made you nervous. Or for number 4 here, to learn a new technique or skill or strategy. So if you can visualize yourself performing that new technique or whatever it is over and over again in your mind, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to do it in reality. Now we're going to listen to Michael Phelps himself talk a little bit about visualization. So pay attention to not just how he used visualization, but what the result was when he was behind the blocks at a big meet like the Olympics.
You wrote a lot about visualization, right? I mean, that WR, that's visualization. You're visualizing that world record. Talk about how that became part of your process and why you think it's so helpful.
I mean, for me, when I got to a swim meet, there's nothing that I can control at that point, right? I can control what I do and how I prepare, sort of getting up behind the block and just racing. I can't control what anybody else does. So for me, I want to know how the race could go, how I don't want the race to go, and in a perfect world, how the race should go. Because it all goes back to preparation. If you're not preparing yourself before the meet, you're not going to get a time you deserve. So for me, I have to make sure I'm doing all the work leading up to a big meet so that I get behind the block and I don't have to think about anything else. I'm not worried about how I prepared. So I started visualizing at like 13, 14, just so everything around me was taken care of when I got to a meet. So I could be completely relaxed. So when I put my headphones on, all I'm thinking about is the music. I get to go up and just do what I practice to do. All of those countless hours of staring at the black line at the bottom of the pool, that was for this moment. So I just never really thought when I got behind the block and let everything do what was supposed to happen. If I didn't get the results that I wanted, then I would just go back to the drawing board. And that's really just how I worked my whole life. But I mean, visualizing just, it just mentally prepares you, and you can kind of check that box off. And I think that's what we wanted to do. Every time we got to a major international competition, we wanted to check off as many boxes as we could. Because if we did that, then what else do we have to worry about? Everything else is just going to happen naturally like it should.
So Michael Phelps, he attributes a lot of his success to visualization. And as you can see there, the result of visualization for him was that he felt prepared and he felt like he could relax and he didn't have to think, right? And so that's the opposite of what a lot of swimmers struggle with, which is the overthinking. He was in a place where he could feel relaxed because he felt prepared. And then, as they mentioned in the first video with Bob Bowman, he could kind of just go on autopilot and execute his race. So I think